Hey guys, Mike here, the Detroit Borg, with a little preview of the 5th generation iPad and the 2nd generation iPad mini. So first let's take a look at the iPad 5 or 5th generation. This is the Retina iPad, 9.7 inch iPad. So I have both the glass and the back shell. So these are not the full products, obviously. This will give you a preview of the overall design. Now this is the first complete redesign of the full-size iPad in 2 years. It's now much thinner. It's also more compact. And I'm going to show you this compared to the 4th generation iPad, just to give you an idea. Right now we don't know how much it's going to weigh, but we can tell you the overall shape, including its thinness and width. So if you compare this to the existing iPad 5, you can see it's just slightly shorter in height than the iPad 4th generation, but it is much thinner. So if you look at it head on or side on, you can see just how much thinner it is than the iPad 4th generation, 2nd generation, and certainly the 1st generation. Now if we take the glass of the iPad 5, we can take a look at how it compares to the existing iPad, the 4th generation. So you can see that we have the same screen size, 9.7 inches, no differences there, probably the same screen resolution, the same Retina display, but you can see it's now much narrower. So you can see they've cut quite a bit away from the bezel for the iPad 5. You can see that the camera cutout as well as the home button are in the same position. They have changed the positioning of the ambient light sensor. So if I move this down here, you can take a look at it. So if you look up here on the iPad 4th generation and 2nd generation, you can see the ambient light sensor is just above the camera versus to the left of the camera on the 5th generation. Now if you look at the home button, you can see the cutout is about the same size as well, so the home button will not shrink down. Now if we line up the iPad 5 panel to the existing display, it gives you an idea of just how much they've shaved off the edges of the iPad. Now taking a look at the design side by side, there is a lot of changes here, right down to the Apple logo. So we have a black glossy Apple logo here. We now have a silvery Apple logo here. It's actually an insert, so if you look back here, you'll see the insert for the Apple logo. It's not really sort of polished into the material like you get with the iPhone. Down here you can see that we're missing our iPad branding on the new one, but like the iPhone 5C and 5S, we'll probably see that thinner font that corresponds with the iOS 7 design. We see down here that they've repositioned the speakers as well. So like the iPad mini, we have the speakers flanking the Lightning connector as opposed to the single rear-firing speaker. So this should give us better audio. Not only is it stereo, but we'll also get audio that fires toward the side of the device as opposed to away from the device, which made it easier to muffle. Now if we look at the side, you can see we have this very wedge-shaped design. A lot of people complain that it was actually uncomfortable to hold just because it is so sharp along the edges. So we now have a more blunt design similar to the iPad mini with that mirror chamfered edge. So we got a nice polished chamfered edge. So right now we know this is available in silver and probably slate as well, like we see with the iPad mini. Who knows if there's going to be other colors. Now if you look at the buttons along the side, you'll see we have a volume rocker on the iPad 4th generation, but individual buttons for the iPad 5th generation. We still have that physical switch for muting or rotation lock. Now the camera here is in a similar position. You can see we have kind of a color matched ring around the camera as opposed to the chrome ring on the iPad 4th generation, and we have our sleep wake button again in the same position. Now another change here is the fact that we have a set of microphones along the back of the iPad 5, so you see one facing toward the rear of the device, one facing toward the top. With the iPad 4th generation, you can see we just had the single microphone at the top. Now taking a close look at the interior of the shell, again this is made out of a single piece of aluminum that has been milled out, so it's very lightweight, very thin and very rigid. If you look inside, you'll see we have the camera cutout with that temporary cover to protect the lens. You see the cutout for the sleep wake button. Up here you see the cutout for the headphone jack. Up here there's the headphone jack. Here you find the magnets for the smart cover. In fact, the smart cover for the iPad 4 does actually work with this. In fact, if we put it right here, you can see it latches on to the shell of the iPad 5, but of course it doesn't fit the iPad 5 very well, so you can see it's a little taller and a little wider. Now while we have magnets on the hinge side, we also have magnets on the right side. So right here you can see the magnets which hold on to the cover when it's closed. Now this is not the cellular version, but like the iPad mini, the SIM tray is probably somewhere on the right side over here. So if you look at the iPad mini, you'll find it right here. Now with the iPad 4th generation, the cellular version, the SIM tray was on the upper left side. But if you look at the left side here, you can see that there probably isn't any room for it this time. Now if we look down by the Lightning connector, you can see quite an elaborately carved structure down here, but on either side are the speakers, and as you can see, they put a little fabric grill in front of them to keep them sealed up. Now you also find grills near the microphone here, so you can see these metal mesh grills to match the color of the silver iPad. Now taking a look at the front glass panel, again you can see we have the cutout for the home button, cutout for the camera. So if you look really closely there, you see the cutout for the camera as well as the ambient light sensor. Now if you flip this around, you can take a look at some of the internals. So you can see again the cutout for the camera as well as the ambient light sensor, which perforates through that edge. You can see the digitizer along the inside here. You can see the connections for the digitizer right here. So pretty slick, you know, it's different design here. So you can see it's thinner along the edge as opposed to that symmetrical design we're familiar with on the iPad that preceded it. If you place it on top here, you can see it fits in pretty nicely. So it fits in pretty flush and you get that nice mirrored chamfered edge. Very nice detail. Again, debuted with the iPhone 5 and the iPod Touch 5th generation and the iPad mini. So it finally comes to the full-size iPad. So again, it looks very, very flush. So it contributes to that very thin design. It doesn't hover above the chassis of the iPad at all. Now the great thing about this design is that it makes it a little more one-handable. So for example, I could one-hand the iPad 4th generation, but this is even more comfortable. You're probably not going to do that. You're going to probably handle it in this configuration. Now like the iPad mini, there will probably be software tweaks to allow you to grip the side of the iPad. Because there is a smaller bezel here, you're more likely to touch the screen, and the software will probably recognize the presence of your thumb and not interact with the screen when you don't want it to. So for example, if you're scrolling, it won't detect two positions here, so instead of scrolling you might be pinching. So they should be able to figure this out for the iPad 5th generation as well. Now if you look at the iPad 4th generation and 5th generation side by side, again you can see a much more compact overall design. It's also much thinner. That's the thing that jumps out when you have them side by side. You can see that the iPad 4th generation kind of raises up off the table versus the iPad 5th generation, which kind of is really thin. And I think the biggest issue I have with the 4th generation isn't necessarily its size, but its weight. It's kind of a heavy device, and I'm hoping that they're able to solve that with the 5th generation iPad and make it lighter and more comfortable to handle for long periods of time. The iPad mini is ideal for that, but of course the iPad mini doesn't have a Retina display, so it kind of would be nice if the iPad mini doesn't get the Retina display. At least you have the 9.7-inch iPad with a Retina display and a much thinner, more compact, lightweight design. So I'm really excited to see how this turns out in the end. And just to compare this to the iPad mini here, again, very similar in overall design. Same thinner side bezel. You can see it's still thicker on the iPad 5. If we zoom in here, you can see the differences here. So you can see it's actually got a very similar bezel along the bottom. It's a little taller for the iPad 5th generation. So if we line up the screens here, you get an idea. But overall, the design is very similar. Same with the camera cutouts. So if you look at the camera cutouts and the ambient light sensors, they're orientated the same. If you look at the edges, again, you have that mirrored bezel, the same port for the microphone. You have, not microphone, but headphone jack. You can see the microphone positioned toward the center. Now the iPad 5 has two microphones as opposed to the single microphone here on the iPad mini. Up here you have your sleep-wake button, and presumably these buttons will also be metal, just like the iPad mini. The buttons for the iPad 4th generation and previously were plastic, so we should see a similar design. Again, we also have that dual volume control as opposed to the volume rocker. You have your physical switch here. Back here you see the camera is very similar, so you have that metal ring around the camera. Not sure what the specs on the camera will be. And we have that silver Apple logo as well, both on the iPad mini and the iPad 5th generation. Of course, it is a little smaller on the iPad mini. Now if we look at the bottom, we'll see our dual speakers flanking the Lightning connector. Again, very similar. Of course, they're bigger on the iPad 5, so possibly louder and clearer audio. Now, the iPad 5th generation is about as thin as the iPad mini. There might be a slight difference here, but overall, it's not a huge difference. But again, you can see the design is very similar. You got that mirror chamfered edge, that more blunter edge for more comfortable gripping, and of course, it also reduces the overall footprint of the iPad. Now, if we look at the iPad mini 2nd generation, you can see there is one slight change. It's almost imperceptible, but that's the fact that the Apple logo is different here. So on the iPad mini 1st generation, the Apple logo was polished into the block of aluminum here. So you can see it's just a polished Apple logo. This time we have a kind of an insert here. So we have a chrome Apple logo here. which is inserted into the metal blank. So it's actually cut through here. So this is a slight change. I'm not sure why that is. There may be a functional reason. Now, besides that Apple logo, there really is no design change here. So if you look at it side by side, you can see we have that cellular window here. We're both looking at cellular versions with that microphone up top. Still a single microphone in this case. We have the headphone jack. We have our sleep-wake button. We have our camera. So if you look at the camera again, looks to be about the same hardware on the outside. We're not sure what the specs will be on that camera yet. We also have our cutouts for the buttons. Same orientation as well, split buttons with that switch. We have our SIM tray. Again, this is a nano SIM. On the bottom, we have our lightning connector and our speakers. So again, stereo speakers. Again, appear to be no differences there. If we look on the inside, right now we don't have the glass to compare, but if we look at the inside, you can see that, again, it's a single piece of aluminum that has been milled out. That cling you heard was the SIM tray falling out here. So the SIM tray is right there, so you can see it fits in like that. So again, one piece of milled aluminum. You see the lightning connector with the speakers down here behind sort of a fabric mesh. Now, along the side, you'll find your cutouts for all the buttons here, as well as the camera right there. You'll find that RF transparent window here for cellular reception, and you'll find magnets here for the smart cover, and of course the existing iPad mini smart cover does work with this design as well, so you can see works just fine. Alrighty guys, I hope you enjoyed this preview of the iPad mini 2nd generation and the iPad 5th generation. Of course, I will be doing detailed unboxings and reviews of both of these when they come out, so stay tuned for those, and of course giveaways in the future. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.